Christopher, welcome aboard.
Thank you for having me on. It's a privilege to be on your show. And
Yeah, yeah, it's great. We met in person a few weeks ago. Actually, it was a month ago now, wasn't it?
yep,
Over a month ago at the Catholic Identity Conference in Pittsburgh, hosted by the Remnant and Michael Matt. We were there with the great Bishop Schneider and a bunch of other great speakers.
that's right. And welcome aboard the movement. And to your credit, you made a bit of a mea culpa publicly instead of jumping on the bandwagon and pretending you were always there.
Right.
And that speaks very well of you. It shows the kind of intellectual integrity that is sadly lacking in other sectors of the church. So thanks for joining us, and you're quite an asset. And
Well,
so is
thanks. And part of the epiphany in this process, I think, is coming to appreciate and understand the message of Our Lady at Fatima. And you've certainly done a lot of the heavy lifting on that, especially as it regards the third secret, which has become something more and more important to me as especially the pontificate of Pope Francis moves along and trying to understand how did we get here and where are we going, you know?
Well, Benedict basically exposed the problem back in 2010 when he made a pilgrimage to Fatima during the Airborne Press Conference. He had selected beforehand certain questions that he wanted to answer. And one of them was about whether the secret, meaning the vision that was published in 2000 without an explanation of the version, involved the homosexual priest crisis. He picked that question and pointedly answered it in the following way, and I'm summarizing, I'm paraphrasing, that the worst threat to the church comes from sin within the church. And this is what is novel in the secret. We've seen this before, he said, in church history, but we're seeing it today in a really terrifying way. In the Italian, he said, in modo veramente terrificante. Meaning, of course, what we're seeing now in terms of the so-called pedophilia scandal, which is actually a homosexual priest scandal. So he linked the secret to sexual corruption within the church and said that the greatest threat to the church is internal, not external. Now, Antonio Socci, who has written on this subject, said that by making that response to that pre-selected question, Benedict reopened the dossier and what he calls the fourth secret of Fatima. And what is the fourth secret? It's an ironic description of the missing part of the third secret. We have this vision of a bishop dressed in white who seems to be the Pope. And then later in the vision, there's a specific reference to the Pope. So already there's confusion. Who's the bishop in white and who's the Pope? The Pope is killed at the top of a hill, along with bishops, priests, and members of the laity, after having barely escaped from a city filled with the dead. What does it mean? When does this happen? Is this Rome? Is it a nuclear holocaust? Is it the end of the world? Why is the Pope killed? Who is it that kills him? All we know is that it's a band of soldiers. But the Virgin is strangely silent about that vision, even though she explains something as obvious as the vision of hell in the first part of the secret. And the reason we know that something is missing, to me this is dispositive, is that the Vatican resorted to Cardinal Sodano to give us an interpretation of the vision. The same corrupt prelate who covered up the scandals of Father Maciel,
Yeah.
who finally, during the pontificate of Pope Benedict, was sent off to a monastery to die in disgrace. So the fact that we don't know what the vision means and that they had to resort to a proposed interpretation by none other than Cardinal Sodano, who has no confidence in the matter, shows us that there must be something missing. There has to be an explanation of this vision. She did not leave us a cipher. She did not leave us in bafflement about what's going to happen to this mysterious bishop in white at some unknown time in the future. There must be an explanation. Now, why hasn't it been revealed? I think Socci came up with a very credible explanation. There is something that Sister Lucia wrote which explains the meaning of the vision. It's probably a crisis in the church, accompanied by a worldwide crisis, a planetary crisis, perhaps the Third World War. And the two crises culminate in this devastating scene, and the Virgin explains it all, and Sister Lucia wrote it down somewhere, perhaps in her notebooks or in a separate document. And the Vatican has persuaded itself that these are just annotations of Sister Lucia. They can't be relied upon, they're not authentic, they're not part of the vision proper, and so they publish the vision alone, because the rest of it's just too explosive to be admitted as an authentic part of the secret. Now, of course, the secret is taken seriously by the Vatican. No longer do they dismiss the third secret. They were forced finally, largely by pressure from Father Gruner's apostolate, to publish at least the visional aspect on June 26, 2000. So they take the apparitions, or they're required to give the appearance of taking them very seriously. And what's lacking is the explanation of the vision. And in that explanation, we would see what has been happening in the church for the past 60 years was the subject of a prophecy by the Blessed Virgin herself, and that the culmination of this, God forbid, would be some kind of catastrophe in which the city of Rome is devastated, probably the city of Rome, and a pope barely escapes alive. And by the way, Pius X, the great sainted pope, had a vision to that effect. He said, I see a successor of mine fleeing the city of Rome in the midst of a disaster, and only to die in disgrace, to be killed while in retirement. Interesting. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about a missing text. It's the soundtrack of the film, if you will.
Exactly. Yeah.
The vision of the film, we don't have the soundtrack.
Yeah.
We have the angel. The angel says penance, penance, penance. But we don't know why the urgency of penance becomes a part of history at that moment, or even when that moment in history occurs. We know nothing really about the meaning of that vision, and the idea that Cardinal Sodano will explain it to us is just, it's laughable.
Yeah. It's
Absolutely
ridiculous.